Hello, my name is Blaine Hartman. This is stop 3 on the data trail, data analysis, in particular analysis of a campsite inventory data set in the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness. Thank you for joining me. This is the data trail. We're going to have a lot of time to think about numbers, but first I'd like to tell you a story. I spent 4 wonderful years working as a wilderness ranger on the Absaroka-Beartooth. It's an incredible place filled with alpine lakes, big granite peaks, and in certain spots, alpine tundra as far as you can see. When we're really lucky, we got to do a patrol on the Beartooth Plateau. We were finishing up one multi-day patrol, feeling pretty accomplished about the scenery we've seen and the work we've done. As we're hiking along, a toilet paper tumbleweed comes floating across the trail. Nearby, we found a pretty heavily impacted campsite. There were nails driven into the trees, the roots were exposed, there were other indicators of soil and vegetation loss, and there was trash in the campfire ring. But worst of all, under every rock we looked, we found human fecal matter, which we had to clean up. I tell you this story because living in Gunnison or throughout the West, many of us like to participate in outdoor recreation, but we don't often think about the ecological impacts of our recreation. Wilderness is held to the highest standard. It must be maintained to a high degree of ecological integrity, but also as a place where humans can find refuge and solitude from the rigors of everyday life. Without good data, the Forest Service has a very difficult job of effectively managing these spaces. My study setting is the Absaroka-Beartooth. It's just north of Yellowstone National Park, and it's extremely vast. It's about 1 million acres. It's very wild and biodiverse. Species range from the rare boreal toad to grizzly bears. It's made up of 2 distinct mountain ranges, which will become important when we talk about the findings. So the Absaroka Range on the west is lower elevation. It's more heavily forested. The Beartooth Plateau is higher elevation. It's got lots of alpine lakes and lots of alpine tundra. So how do forest managers monitor impacts in a wilderness? Well, one way is wilderness campsite inventory. So since 1994, every 5 years, wilderness rangers have been going out and surveying every known campsite in the wilderness. There are currently around 1,400 known campsites. So it's a pretty monumental task when you think about 1 million acre wilderness and 1,400 different campsites. So for each of these campsites, 63 attributes are collected. These include the GPS coordinates or the habitat type of the area. But what we're really interested in are measures of impacts. For example, we'll measure the campsite barren area of the campsite. There are measures of vegetation loss or other soil loss. There's measures of how many damaged trees are in the area. Are there invasive species present? Invasive species often like to hitchhike on hikers or horsepackers or mules. The number of campfire rings present. There's a number of adverse ecological impacts from campfires. And so using all these measures of impacts, the Forest Service created what they call the limits of acceptable change equation. This equation quantifies the environmental impact for each campsite. And this is really important because then we can compare impacts between campsites spatially and over time from 1994 to 2017. And then in that way, we can see where impacts are concentrated or how they're changing. So my task is to take this big data set, about 6,700 data points, and identify trends in recreation, identify where impacts are concentrated, and identify if current management has been effective. So what are we finding? Well, we have some really promising results. Campsite impacts are decreasing almost throughout the wilderness with a few exceptions. If you look at this map on the left, it's from 1999, and it's the average impact by watershed. Red is a higher impact, with white being a lower impact. As we can see, looking at the 2017 map on the right, there's a lot more white throughout the wilderness, in particular on the western side of the wilderness, which is that Absaroka range. Impacts seem to be concentrated on the Beartooth Plateau on the eastern portion of the wilderness. Average impacts aren't just higher on the Beartooth Plateau, it also has a higher number of campsites. So that crosshatch area is a watershed that has 50 or more campsites, which is a relatively high number of campsites. So we're seeing there's a lot more campsites per watershed on the Beartooth Plateau, with also average higher impacts. So over the last 23 years, impacts have really decreased in the Absaroka range in the western part of the wilderness, where they've decreased less on the Beartooth Plateau. In certain areas, they're staying steady. We're also finding that wilderness-wide, there's fewer active campsites. So in 1999, there were approximately 1,100 known active campsites. In 2017, there's about 950 active campsites. And this is with the discovery of new campsites. So we're seeing, and especially on that western portion of the map, there's more campsites that are recovering. They're almost indiscernible. The vegetation has grown back. And on the Beartooth Plateau, that the rate of recovery is much less. So now that we know impacts are decreasing in most areas, we're wondering, why are these impacts decreasing? And there's three theories that kind of go hand in hand. The first is that trends in recreation are changing. People are recreating in a different way. The second is that visitation rates are lowered, especially in certain areas, but maybe not in others. And then the third is that leave no trace principles have been more widely adopted. People are leaving less impacts per camper. So we can look at trends of recreation in the data set, and we can see that the use of horse and mules in the Absaroka-Beartooth has decreased dramatically. So in 1994, about 43% of all campsites had stock manure present. That's an indicator that a horse or a mule was there in the recent past. In 2017, we're finding that only 18% of all campsites had stock manure present, a decrease of 25% over 23 years. Really dramatic. We're also seeing that there's fewer campfires in the wilderness, as evidenced by the number of campfire rings wilderness-wide. So in 2004, there were approximately 2,100 known campsites in the wilderness. That number has almost gone in half in the most recent data set in 2017. There's about 1,100 known campfire rings in the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness. That's a pretty dramatic decrease. And that goes hand in hand with leave no trace principles becoming more widely adopted. People are more likely to use a gas stove rather than a high impact campfire. So our major findings, well, impacts are decreasing in the majority of the wilderness, with a few exceptions on the Beartooth Plateau. Most campsite impacts today are concentrated on the Beartooth Plateau, especially on the northern side, with hotspots in the East and West Rosebud watersheds and then the Lake Fork watershed. Recreation trends are changing. There's less campsite use in the Absaroka range. The use of horse and mules in recreation appears to be decreasing, and campfire use appears to be decreasing as well. So what we're finding is that current Forest Service management, combined with outside recreation trends and education with leave no trace principles, is reducing impacts wilderness-wide, which is really good news. So hopefully the next generation of wilderness rangers won't have to deal with any toilet paper tumbleweeds on the Beartooth Plateau. Thank you for your time. I'd like to thank my community sponsor, Camille Krutoff, my old boss, Jeremy Zimmer, and my mentor, Sally Thode. Thank you very much. We'll have questions here in a minute.